experiences where you find out about people who you wish had you done that in your life other than necessary things? So I won't belabor the necessary things I did decades ago. But these guys are doing something fascinating, which was really illuminating to hear about when Joe Zebrowski, Kathryn Mahan, graduate student, is that appropriate? Just completed, on your way? New Mexico Highlands?
Not a student anymore.
Okay, all right.
Congratulations.
All right, but, you know, sometimes we don't pay attention enough to what's going on out east of us, and these guys are. So when Joe was sending out emails, recruiting volunteers to help in this Rio Mora restoration project, and I don't know if any of you have driven east, but you take the shortcut, you know, through the Rio Mora Valley to get to I-40. It's just a beautiful, beautiful drive, and Joe is that way and a little bit north. We're going to learn more about the exact location, but briefly, and this is from that authoritative journal known as the Taos News, with thanks to Bev Haldeman, who I don't see, but I see TD here. Bev writes the great articles for the Native Plant Society monthly, and this was just last week. So, now this is a complicated structure you're going to explain to us. There's the Rio Mora National Wildlife Refuge and the Invasive Species Management Project, right? Which is funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they have left out, and there's the Rio Mora Conservation Area. I mean, it sounds like a lot of organizational structure, but very briefly, Joe's background is really directing the Friends of the Las Vegas National Wildlife Refuge. He teaches Geographic Information Systems at the Mexico Highlands, and also has a research position there. And here's what I found just fascinating. Ecological management support is one of his professional skills, as you know, among other things. Kathryn is, I guess, a recent graduate, right, of New Mexico Highlands, who of the environmental geology program, right? Fascinating things people get to learn, and has been working on a variety of restoration projects going on in the area, which I'm sure they'll tell us more about. So, please inform us.
All right, so I'm really pleased, great turnout, and thanks for inviting us here to talk about this project. Volunteering with invasives sounds kind of intimidating to me, but I'll tell you the story of how that all came about from my perspective here in a few moments. But here's just a view of a portion of the Rio Mora National Wildlife Refuge. So that wasteland you think you're driving through to get the shortcut to I-25, where it's just grasses and a few cows. Of course, being native plant folks, we kind of like grasses too, or think those are pretty cool. But if you kind of go just over the rise a little bit, there's a river down there, and that's the Mora River as it traverses through the Rio Mora National Wildlife Refuge. The green, it's not Ireland. Maybe it's false advertising for that part of New Mexico, but it was last July we were pretty flush compared to just a year or so prior, where it was not so green, even though, and probably not so wet. So that's just the scenery of the refuge. And what I'm going to talk about is, a little bit about the refuge, because it's a new place. Most of you probably have not heard of it or not familiar with it. And many of you probably are not even familiar with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Refuge system, and I won't go into a lot of detail about that. And by the way, you know, I don't work for the Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm a volunteer. They gave me this nice shirt, so I felt obligated to wear it. They do appreciate volunteers very much, so I'll make that point. So we'll talk about that. Very briefly, a little bit about some terms around invasive plants, what this whole nationwide volunteer program is about, and finally, what we're doing with this project that I'm here to talk about tonight, and which was recently renewed for another year. So this is a general map of the Rio Mora National Wildlife Refuge. So that term ecological restoration support or whatever, support being the operative word. I make maps and sometimes get to go out and play in the woods. So it's about 4,200 acres, and they're in the southern part of Mora County, just almost at the county line with San Miguel County, east of Mora. So that Route 161, if you go to the west or left, that would take you towards Mora, and down to the right takes you towards I-25 and Watrous, to give you an idea of where this is. The old ghost town of Loma Parda is right in the center on the river of the refuge, so it's an enclave, if you will, of private property, about 10 acres in the middle of the refuge. And that's an interesting historical place. Fort Union National Monument's about 6 miles to the north. So there's some interesting history also out there. So the Rio Mora National Wildlife Refuge, it used to be referred to, or was, the Wind River Ranch. And I don't know, has anyone here heard of Wind River Ranch or been involved with that? It was established as the Wind River Ranch by the Taos, and they were in the art business in Santa Fe mostly, but live in New York. So they have a long history in art in northern New Mexico. But they had established this as a working ranch. They had a vacation home and actually ran a horse ranch for a while. Then in 2005, they established the Wind River Ranch Foundation with a purpose around research and education around ecological restoration, particularly looking at healing the land that had been damaged over so many years by poor grazing practices at times. And you can imagine, as a horse ranch, horses are pretty hard on the land. So they felt a strong need to try and restore and heal the land and educate youth and others in that restoration. And through this, they really developed or a expertise at that location developed around small stream restoration or restoring arroyos that had been badly eroded. I like this statement that was basically, you know, their mission at the time: a center for ecological restoration, research, education for youth, and a place where great minds of the conservation world would come together and create solutions to counter degrading ecological systems. A lofty goal, but one that is attempted to be followed through, as this was donated to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that happened in 2012. The Taos generously, well, they had been looking for a little while of a place to donate this property. They were not interested in maintaining it anymore, getting on in years. There's a lot of work, and but they wanted to see this property preserved. And they looked at different nonprofits. They looked at the Smithsonian. They looked at Nature Conservancy. They looked at various entities and couldn't really find someone who would be committed to keeping that piece of property. Some would accept it, but they would want to use it to fundraise, perhaps sell, to put money to other uses, for example. The Fish and Wildlife Service, though, started to get interested in this idea of conservation areas, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And this seemed like a prime location and an interesting piece of property, and a deal that was hard to refuse because they donated it in whole, and also with 3 years of basically operating funds and a small endowment to keep some of the programs that they had started going. So they're very committed to keeping this project, that mission I showed earlier, going. And so that made it a relatively easy sell to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And part of that purpose, again, is creating this kind of corridor. It becomes a central node for the Mora watershed for developing this corridor through conservation easements and additional land acquisition if the opportunities and funding are available. And again, continuing that education and conservation mission. The day-to-day operations are managed by the Denver Zoo. You might wonder, well, where would a zoo come into a wildlife refuge? It sounds like, cross purposes almost. But if you've looked at zoos in modern times, they have a very strong conservation mission. They see themselves as proponents for keeping, wildlife in nature as well as exposing the population to that wildlife in a zoo environment. So they have field stations around the world. They have in Mongolia, Botswana, Peru, they have in Vietnam, I believe, and they used to have one in East Africa, and they didn't really have a North America one, and they're really interested in that grasslands ecosystem. So this was a good fit for them. Plus, there's a history of staff who had been affiliated with the Denver Zoo at the Wind River Ranch who then carried that relationship forward as well. So that funding from the THAOS actually went to the Denver Zoo to maintain these operations, not to the Fish and Wildlife Service. In developing this, a fairly unique partnership evolved. New Mexico Highlands University had been sending students there for education and research for several years, and we wanted to keep that going, so we kind of eased our way into a partnership, if you will, and kind of, once again, sold them on it because I gave them the map, all the mapping I did for the Wind River Ranch, and they said, well, that's a good deal, we'll keep you on, and you're useful to us for now at least. And then the Pueblo of Poake, we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute as well, but they've been on-the-ground partners with us at the refuge as well. And so in the bottom right, you see a picture from the signing ceremony. Secretary of the Interior at the time, Salazar, came down and signed the paperwork for the transfer. It was about around the 500th refuge coming into the Fish and Wildlife Service. So what comes together here, as I mentioned, this idea of conservation and conservation research, restoring or healing the land, and doing this education and outreach mission with these partners. The Pueblo maintains a small herd of bison out there, and that was there from the Wind River Ranch time, and through a lot of careful, almost I would call it diplomacy with the Fish and Wildlife Service, they've been able to keep that herd there and found ways that the Fish and Wildlife interests in bison and the Pueblo interests may align. But very unique for a federal agency, especially a Fish and Wildlife Service, to have an animal population that's owned by another entity using their land. Fish and Wildlife Service will have grazing sometimes on National Wildlife Refuge, but this is a little bit different. So, in sum, this picture kind of gives you a little bit of a view. The top two, the idea of the stream restoration work, bison and wildlife, big and small, from grasshoppers to bison to small prairie dog. During the Wind River Ranch time, a small prairie dog colony was reestablished out there with the support of adjacent landowners, which is a neat trick to get ranchers supporting prairie dog, but they're Gunnison prairie dogs, so they don't have the same kind of, for lack of a better word, invasive reputation that the other prairie dogs have.
Look bigger too. Yeah, that's
And and that's one of our Denver Zoo staff, Shantini, with the prairie dog, and again, a student group, Friends of the Refuge on a hike out there as well. And just to make the point that it's not your average government facility, there's the sign to our office, a nice piece of artwork done by the foreman out there, our all-around ranch hand there. So of course, plants are what we're interested in here in this group, in addition to all these other things, but primarily plants for this audience, and that's interesting set of plant communities out there as well that we're trying to learn more about. As a map guy, you'll see more maps. You'll be sick of maps before this is all over. But pardon the colors, but this map is intended to kind of give you an overview of the broad plant communities or vegetation communities at the Rio Mora. So you can generally see the boundary there, and these colors represent groupings based on a program called the Southwest REGAP. It was it is a program by New Mexico State to map different wildlife habitat, and included in that was they developed a vegetation classification for the states, the Southwest United States. And so these plant community names, which you can't read, are the ones that were identified from that. At a much coarser scale than I'm showing here, than this shows, we did a little bit of finessing with our mapping program to do that. But in a nutshell, the brown, all that brown is mostly pinyon juniper, and the lighter tannish color is shortgrass prairie. So that's what's dominating the area. There's some riparian area, some ponderosa along the bluffs and cliffs, and some different kinds of shrublands around there that are not exceptionally accurately mapped on here, and that's one thing we hope to do in coming years is develop a refined map of these different plant communities. But again, a couple private inholdings in there, and a nice river flowing through the middle. So what about volunteers? I mean, for me at first, what a concept. You're going to actually recruit people to come and pull weeds. I don't like pulling weeds in my house, in my yard. Why am I going to go to somebody else's place and pull their weeds? So maybe part of it, and again, the response we got to our call was, well, it's a chance to go to a interesting place that's beautiful that you might not have normal access to. So we tried to sweeten the pot a little bit, and we bought lunch too. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But this is actually a nationwide program, and the purpose is as much to educate people about invasive plants as it is to get work done on the ground. There's a limit to what you can do with the amount of work you can get done with volunteers. You can get a lot done, but there's a bigger staffed program across the refuge system for managing invasive plants. So the purpose is to get these volunteers as partners in working outside the refuge boundary to build a better community, better habitat outside the boundaries of the refuge as well as within it. And really it's an excellent resource for information. I put a link to their website, and we can share that in some other way, but there's like even a little tutorial in there to take you through basic concepts of invasive species and invasive plants. So some terminology, and I pulled this out of their tutorial, and it's actually tied to an executive order. And so they come up with some basic categories in this realm of invasive plants. Alien species, basically a non-native plant of any kind. Invasive, you see the definition, key points: causing economic or environmental harm to human health, and that's kind of pretty a limiting definition. We'll talk about that in a second. And then native species are any plants that are not a result of this kind of introduction that historically occurred. Does anybody look at that invasive species definition, and anything pop out as maybe an issue with that definition? Sound pretty good? You'd be behind that? You'd say, yes, that's a good definition of invasive species. Well, one thing kind of coming from the restoration angle I'm finding is maybe that term alien species is a little bit too limiting. Because as we see through historical poor land management practices, perhaps there are native species that have kind of gotten outside of what they normally would be doing and are also could be considered invasive. One that comes to mind is juniper encroachment into grasslands, and perhaps yucca as well. And many of us have probably seen, and sage, often a result of overgrazing and suppression of natural fire in the landscape. And so when we talk about and work with invasives, we take that more holistic definition in mind. In fact, some of these, particularly the juniper, are a potential issue at the Rio Mora as well.
sagebrush is native to the ecosystem, but it's invasive.
It's treated or considered invasive by land managers because
It's not alien.
it's not alien,
It's not
though.
alien, but it's invasive.
Right,
Whereas this definition, it has to be alien before it can be deemed invasive.
right. Doesn't seem to be a regulatory issue at this point. I haven't seen anybody say, don't go after that plant because it's not alien, but that just shows you what the executive public law definition is.
But wouldn't the junipers just develop naturally over time? I always thought that, you had grasslands for a while, and then the small trees were able to take root, and they grow trees, and then you get forest, and then...
That could be a very long discussion about successional stages and things like that, and there's an element of that, but also you have to look at what's been removed from the environment, and particularly fire, and perhaps things that were quote-unquote alien to the environment, such as livestock that came in and perhaps displaced some natural processes that would have kept the juniper in a more controlled way.
It just happened maybe too fast?
Perhaps. So, and again, you can't take a cookie cutter approach on it too. You have to look at all the processes in place before you make a determination about what's going on. And I think some people would still argue that whether that would be invasive or not. But I'm glad you raised that point. So a couple other definitions: non-native, non-indigenous, kind of like same as an alien plant, but these are from other regulatory sources. Aquatic nuisance species, you've probably seen, especially if you've driven south on I-25 towards Las Cruces, all the warnings about cleaning your boat and all that. A very big concern in waterways are different plants. Hydrilla is the one that's shown here. And then this word that often people just automatically substitute with invasive is this term noxious weed. And noxious is a much narrower, almost regulatory term in that it's really speaking to those impacts on public health, agriculture, recreation, all of that. It's determined at a state level. They will list certain plants as noxious plants. And it doesn't have to be a native. I mean a non-native. It could be a native also.
Local weed.
Right, that would be, because how many ranchers really want a lot of that? So just another term, people often substitute invasive and noxious, and there's technical differences there. And the plant there, I won't expect anybody to botanically identify as toadflax is the one they're using as an example here, one of several varieties. By the way, I'm not a botanist, don't claim to be a botanist. I'm a native plant enthusiast. I'm a member of the Native Plant Society, and I was in Texas before I moved here as well. So where does our project kind of come in then? So we, as the Friends of the Las Vegas National Wildlife Refuge, and this is one of those situations where you sometimes say yes too easy. The refuge manager who oversees the Rio Mora Refuge asked us to take advantage of this application opportunity. Every year the Fish and Wildlife Service, they have an invasives program, and they offer up a certain amount of money to refuges to encourage volunteer support. And we hem and hawed about doing this, and finally the day that the application was due, we sat down and wrote this lofty project that was designed to meet these goals. It had to address inventory, monitoring, or control of invasives, had to include membership by a friends group or other volunteers. And I should mention that friends groups are kind of a booster club, if you will, for Fish and Wildlife Service refuges. We're 501c3 organizations formed around supporting a particular wildlife refuge or group of refuges. And the Friends of Las Vegas National Wildlife Refuge supports the Las Vegas Refuge, the refuge up in Maxwell, and now the Rio Mora, which are organized by the Fish and Wildlife Service as the Northern New Mexico Refuge Complex. So it had to include volunteers, of course. We have to include a monitoring program into it. And this whole early detection rapid response, they wanted people to be looking out for target or key species as part of the process. But the purpose wasn't just to give money to the Refuge for their invasives program. It was central to have this volunteer involvement, although refuges tend to get some things that they would otherwise have to pay for out of their normal budget, and we'll talk about some of that too. So our project, we again were pretty lofty and tried to be different than your average go out and pull weeds with us kind of project. So we looked at the Rio Mora. We knew its history of grazing and kind of poor land management and the need for restoration and the history of restoration, and said, well, what role do invasives play both in the degradation of that landscape and in its restoration? And we already have their, what I call a restoration demonstration site, where they've been working on stream restoration, trying to improve the hydrologic function of a portion of the Rio Mora River, which that restoration still, probably the final call is out as how effective it is, but it started a pattern of doing all these arroyo restoration projects as well. So we like that restoration role, how do plants fit in. And one thing we noticed is where they did a lot of this landscaping, if you will, they left it for nature to just kind of repopulate with plants, and there's a lot of disturbance. And where that disturbance occurs, of course, you're going to get weeds and other invasives. So we thought, let's look at how we could restore this with plants that exist on the refuge itself without bringing external genetics into the refuge. And we could always go out and buy bags of native plant seed, which come from Wyoming or Montana or Idaho and other places, and we thought, well, let's see if we can do better and develop our own seed source out there. And when we restore with plants from that local area, as well as transplants where appropriate as well. And we learned about the Seeds of Success program. Has anybody heard of that? This is a federal program. It's run right now by the BLM, but they have partners in state and other agencies, and actually Los Lunas, no, it's not Los Lunas, it's the Mexico State Facility Alcalde. They oversee this for New Mexico, but it's actually a protocol for harvesting and storing native seeds for projects such as this. So we're trying to adopt to that. It's much too management intensive for a group of volunteers to do on their own, but we wanted a good baseline to go by. So one of our goals with this project was to train volunteers in doing this type of seed harvesting, to create that seed bank, and also at the same time survey the refuge, identify what plants there are, and build a herbarium. And the herbarium, our goal is either through the actual plant specimens or through photographs and illustrations, show them at different growth stages so we can recognize native and non-native plants in their different stages. It's not always, when it's flowering and it's easy to find. We want to see it when it's first coming up. So that's a big part of our goals. And of course, to do that, we wanted to acquire the supplies and equipment needed to do this. And we just threw out we put together a pretty solid budget, and we're very ambitious, and I think we actually asked for $20,000 for all this, and they surprised us and gave us $15,000, which was more than, I figured first they'd just toss the application altogether, but they liked the idea. It was bold and different than a lot of other projects. So this budget was used to procure some of this supplies and equipment, to pay for the lunches for volunteers, pay for a certain amount of transportation costs, conferences for some of the staff, and some good equipment. We got some GPS equipments for mapping out there, things like that. So it was put to a good purpose, but I'll talk later on about kind of our report card on this project, if you will.
And when did you get it?
So we received the call went out February of 14, and we received the funding about April of 2014. And so also we had to spend it all by October 1st, of course, because it's a federal program. So we did pretty good. We established a plan and more or less followed it. So that resulted in some of the things that came your way, our email spams here from the Friends of the Refuge, because we were the sponsoring organization for this grant. The money did not come to the Friends, it stayed in the Refuge system, but we were the ones who pulled it together. And then we, of course, posted information on our website to tell folks about this, and we also got it on Facebook. And by the way, I appreciate Taos Chapter's Facebook page. That's a good way. You guys are a busy bunch. Kind of make us look bad sometimes. So our project area, of course, with a handful of volunteers in this program, we had to start somewhere. I mentioned that restoration site. It's a small part of the refuge, about 7 acres along the Mora River, right there in the center, essentially, of the refuge. And zooming in a little bit, this is kind of a sort of a relief map of our project area. So that tan area was the area that we surveyed and basically consider the area for treatment, more or less. Plants, they're not going to go where you tell them to, so we'll kind of keep the whole area in mind. But it doesn't show well there, but there's somewhat of a drop-off from the northwest down to the river. It's somewhat incised. The history of this, and Kathryn can correct me if I'm wrong, but historical land use of agriculture, they actually pushed the river over and out of its historic channel and straightened it. And what one of the projects are trying to do is reintroduce the meandering into the river, which is a long-term thing. We don't know how long it'll take to see it, but there is some evidence that the treatments that they've been doing in the stream are having some impact. So there's an aerial photo of the area. So mostly cottonwoods they are all cottonwoods for the larger trees, and then willows along the stream, and different types of shrubs and herbaceous plants and grasses in there. And we'll talk more about the plants in a moment. And this is just color infrared because, again, I'm a map geek and have to show it in every different way. So the vegetation is bright red, so it reflects strongly in the infrared. So that's kind of a good way to find vegetation from aerial photography if you have access to that kind of information. And so this is just some normal people pictures of the project area. And that's us out there kind of planning it, looking over where do we want to do this work. You can see we're standing kind of on a little bit of a bluff right above the river, so it's kind of bare ground down to the river. That's April timeframe, not much was growing, but through the season, where you see the March picture and then the same general area in July. When we first got out there, it's like piece of cake. This is going to be too hard. We can knock this out in a day. Until we saw what was actually growing back in July, and then it was like, well, maybe this is a little more complicated of a place, but we'll go with it anyway. So what did we actually do? So this project was in place essentially from April through September of 2014. And we shut down in October. One, we spent all the money, and two, the weather was changing. It wasn't as much of an issue to be out there. There wasn't as much to do out there. But during that time, we focused on a few weeds we knew were a problem and that we could easily identify and get untrained folks out there to work on, and that was cheatgrass, Russian thistle, kochia, and poison hemlock. Those were plants that the management there thought were somewhat troublesome for this area, and they would like to have that area restored to a more natural plant community. Not all of them are really problem plants from a big picture USDA. They don't tend to worry about Russian thistle or so much, but we didn't like it out there. So we had 8 actual events where we went and pulled weeds, and we actually wound up with, in addition to the removals, but some kind of administrative work, about a little over 300 hours worth of volunteer time spent on this project with volunteers from you all, Hermit's Peak Watershed Alliance, sent some folks out, Tierra Encantada, which is a charter school in Santa Fe, brought a school group, Denver Zoo brought groups out, and our Friends group brought people out. We kind of drafted these school groups. They would be out there for some educational mission, and kind of part of their price of admission was to go and spend a few hours working on these weeds, and it worked out really well. They had fun, got to be outside, so we're going to continue that. We also had a weeds workshop at the Las Vegas National Wildlife Refuge where we had representatives from the Watershed Alliance, Covera Coalition, and the Soil Water Conservation District do a presentation about different types of weeds and weed management and the resources they can offer to landowners on invasives. And we wound up the program with what Kathryn's going to talk about in a moment, a vegetation survey. And through this process, we were able to engage volunteers not just in the on-the-ground activities, but in some of the planning efforts involved. And we had fun. It may not have seemed so at the time, all the time, but we did have fun. We tried to wrap up with a nice hike at the end of the day, something like that. And again, this is a place that's not open to the public. So it's a chance to go behind the scenes. So we observed a vast variety of, I won't say vast, but a fair variety of plants, not inclusive of everything that's in the area. And I'm not going to go over each one of these plants, but a good mix of natives and exotics and invasives in that project area. And I'll let Kathryn come up and talk about the plant survey and our approach to that.
Great. Okay, so we did two different types of surveys. The first one is NMRAM. Are any of you guys familiar with NMRAM? No? Okay, cool. And then that was sort of how we determined how we were going to set up our second set of surveys. So NMRAM stands for New Mexico Rapid Assessment Method. It's a whole monitoring protocol it's still in development. It's a collaboration between the Environment Department and Natural Heritage New Mexico. It's developed, or it's adapted from a California Rapid Assessment Method. And this is a monitoring protocol that reflects large-scale changes. So if you're familiar with the EPA levels of monitoring, it's level 1 and 2. Level 1 is kind of if you look at maps and things like that. And then level 2 is if you just go out and do pretty rapid field work. So there's not super detailed stuff. This is not plots and clippings. This is something that will just take you a couple hours. And same thing, it's not appropriate to do it on a monthly basis or anything. It's something that will show changes every year or couple of years. So that's the one that we did first. And generally it has 3 major components. There's an abiotic component, which deals with the river. And we didn't do that in this case. There's also a landscape component, which is a lot of mapping. We didn't use the NMRAM for that either. Joe did a lot of that mapping his own way. And then there's the biotic section of the NMRAM, which is actually what we used. So that's the main things that looks at are what's up here: vertical and horizontal diversity within your project area, if you have native tree regeneration, what your noxious invasive presence is, and then your overall native plant community composition. An NMRAM, what you get after you do all of this, you basically have a workbook you go out in the field and fill out. There's a lot of check boxes and questions you answer and things that it tells you to measure. And then you get a score between 1 and 4. 4 is good and 1 is poor. So one of the things that this gave us is a map with a bunch of polygons drawn on it. And these polygons are different plant communities. And we mapped these out in a couple ways using the Hink and Omart system. If you're familiar with that, it's just structures. So a type 1 is a high structure forest with understory. Type 2 is a forest that doesn't have much understory, and so on. It gets broken down that way. So we mapped out the polygons based on that, and then for each polygon, we recorded the 2 dominant plants that we were observing in each strata, and the strata were being the tall woodies, which is over 15 feet, the short woodies, which is 5 to 15 feet, and then the herbaceous. So it's just broken down that way. Those are then rated as invasive or exotic and native, and then weighted out to give you a score. along with the other things we talked about, the horizontal diversity and the vertical diversity and so on. The reason we wanted to do this and map out these plant communities is that it gave us a place to set up the second part of our monitoring protocol, which is just a line point intercept, where you have transects, and our transects are permanent. Hang on.
can't see them very clearly on there, but you see the numbers.
Yeah, you can kind of see like this one. There are green lines there, and those are the transects that we set up based on our plant communities. We wanted to get transects that would catch all of the communities that we had observed. So with those transects, what we do, that's more appropriate to do on a monthly basis. You just take a pin flag and you go out. It's every 60 centimeters, you drop your pin, and whatever plants the pin is touching, you write them down. It's pretty simple. There's a really cool spreadsheet that was developed by New Mexico State, and if you code everything the way that they code it, you can put it in their spreadsheet and it'll calculate basal cover, surface cover, and then you'll have a plant list also. So, how do you go back, Joe? Okay. So these are the scores that we got when we did the NMRAM of our site. So we had good relative native plant community composition. We had good horizontal diversity. We had fair vertical diversity. Our native riparian tree regeneration was on the border between being fair and being good. And then the invasive exotic plant species cover was poor, which meant there were a lot of invasives when we started this project. Overall, it was a 2.4. This is fair score. And again, this is something that we can go back in a couple years and get another score and see how that compares. But, okay.
So to me, the survey is kind of the most exciting part of this program moving forward. We've done one, and now we want to continue it through this year to really get a more complete inventory of what's in that site and kind of set the stage for other surveys at the refuge. But in my assessment, this program fell short of what our expectations were during the year. We did not do any seed collection or herbarium development. Although we did procure all the supplies to do this. We have all the plant presses, we have bags for the seeds, we even have a freezer for the seeds, all kinds of, we're well stocked to do this work. And we did not achieve what we'd hoped to as far as volunteer opportunities. And a lot of that was driven by some Fish and Wildlife Service policies that they didn't know about and we didn't know about when we started this. And particularly the fact that there had to be a Fish and Wildlife Service staff person present anytime volunteers are working on the refuge. They don't have to be on the site, but they have to be on the refuge. One thing I didn't mention was with this donation of the Rio Mora to Fish and Wildlife Service, no staff came with it. The refuge complex, which is 3 refuges, over 20,000 acres, is managed by a full-time staff of 8. And they have no staff assigned here. It's all Denver Zoo. We thought the Denver Zoo would be able to act in their place, and they said, no, not so fast. So they were able to sneak in a lot of work. I'll say sneak in because they had these groups coming in under permits that, like schools, they had their liability insurance and all that, so they could have them working. But for a volunteer off the street, they wouldn't let the Denver Zoo supervise them without a permit. So we're working through that right now to see what the best approach to doing that, essentially to get a permitting system going for volunteers who want to come work out here. It just seemed kind of ridiculous to get a permit to do the work the Fish and Wildlife Service wants you to do, but that's kind of the reality. So our record, you know, check off those 3 boxes. We did get a reasonable survey done. We created our demonstration site and we got the equipment going, but we didn't do all those other things that we thought were central to our project. So the next step, well, you know, we didn't call it failure by any means, and we went back this year and asked for funding, and they gave us what we asked for, which kind of surprised me a little bit as well, but it also speaks to that this program is kind of flush with funds for Fish and Wildlife Service. They came back and asked if we wanted more. That doesn't happen very often, but we had to be realistic because this was kind of stretching what we think we can do with the staff support, but we'll figure it out. So our proposal was at least 4 volunteer removal events. Actually, we went in saying about 10. They cut us back to 4, but didn't cut our funding. So we'll work that one out. We want to continue the monitoring that Kathryn talked about and get our seed harvesting and herbarium development going, and kind of focus maybe on the partnerships with these organizations, because if we're working with an organization, they can get a permit and we don't have to mess with some of this other nonsense about the staff. And you know, I understand the reasons. It's just kind of disappointing that you have that limitation thrown on there. So what we're going to do, we already have one Denver Zoo person going to a seed collection workshop in Santa Fe, and she's going to develop a training or else bring other people in to do trainings on seed harvesting and get that underway. We're going to resume our monitoring the sites. We're going to have some education activities around this, both on the refuge and off the refuge. We want to start work on a plant guide for the refuge, continue to have these removal events, and get our herbarium going. So we're basically want to keep going what we'd hoped to start last year, and I think we have a good shot at it based on the lessons we learned last year. And you know, future monitoring, again, we want to try to take advantage of technology to extend some of the information we're learning about these plant communities to see how we can get some technology to assist us in extrapolating some of that information to other parts of the refuge. So this is my invitation. Join our volunteer events. We promise we'll actually have them when we say we will this time. Feel free to volunteer to take charge of some portion of this. If someone wants to sign up and be the coordinator for developing a plant guide or the herbarium or organize these seed collection events, we're open to any kind of volunteer activity that people are interested in. With this permit process, it also leads to the potential to stay overnight on the refuge. There is a bunkhouse. There's actually a house, a 3-bedroom house, so there is potential for accommodation out there as well. So if anyone is interested in participating or wants more information about this program, Shantini is the restoration coordinator for the refuge from the Denver Zoo. I put her name at the first on the application. I learned my lesson last time. And then also you can contact me. And again, it couldn't be done in any case without a great team of partners. We were very fortunate to have people interested in this and supporting it. And this was my kind of going crazy with logos. But you know, it's a chance to see a beautiful part of New Mexico that people just don't ordinarily get to know in a part that people think is kind of a wasteland.
Well, of course, you're not going to have your seed collection volunteer thing until what?
Later, probably late summer, fall, depending on what the plants are, right? And we kind of mapped out kind of a schedule of when to do those based on. Yes?
Do you have your dates set for the weeding?
Not yet. We just got notified that we were getting funded for this, and now we're negotiating with the Fish and Wildlife Service staff to guarantee that they will have a staff person present, kind of build a schedule because they canceled on us a few times last year, so we hope to have that worked out.
So it's not open to the public?
No, the refuge is closed. It was just joined the system in 2012. They did a big public scoping process to bring it in. Now they have to do habitat management plans, comprehensive conservation plans, utilization plans, and more plans on top of that before they can open up. The intention is probably that the whole refuges are not like parks. They're normally closed unless people are specifically allowed in. There will be a public nature trail on the refuge. They've already mapped out where they want that to be, and we're still kind of going a little bit back and forth, but by the time that goes through the environmental reviews, it'll probably be 2 years, And again, the ability to have that is going to be dependent on whether the staff can support maintenance of a parking area, a restroom, all the logistics that come with having public access. So it's basically by permit only for the near future. Yes?
Are plants from Taos County considered invasive if they went to Rio Mora Refuge?
So invasive would not be the word. Right now, the history, alien to that particular place, we don't really have a policy right now. They have seeded parts of the area with other seeds from other native plants from other sources. So there might be an opportunity to transplant. Again, our goal is really to keep the genetic stock there local, though. So I think that's what we're going to try to do and see how that goes.
Do you have a greenhouse, and are you going to do the same thing that we're doing with our native plants?
I think our goal is to seed on site. And one thing, for example, there are some hay fields out there that were used for various purposes over the years, including providing hay for the bison. And we're starting to use the baling to bale blue grama. And so we've been baling blue grama out there, and that's been used both for supplemental feed for the bison. They like that better than alfalfa, and also for restoration when we need to lay down some seed. We'll just spread out some blue grama. I'm a little bit leery because I don't know what else is being bundled with that bale of blue grama, but it's better than probably hay you'd buy at the store. Yes?
Are there beaver there?
Yes, that's, and maybe Kathryn, you might be more familiar with the beaver
Yeah.
there.
There are at least 2 dams in the river.
Yeah, at least two beaver dams on the actual river.
And if they're encouraged and left alone, will they encourage the return to the meandering, or is that going to take human?
What do you think?
Where they've been doing most of the restoration. And
Can you stand up? We can't hear you.
Sorry. The beaver dams are above the area where they were doing the river restoration, and that part of the river is actually in a lot better shape. So whether that is directly related to the beaver is a question, but it looks that way.
It probably is.
I wish I would have brought a picture because there's this rather large kind of S-shaped beaver dam that withstood all the flooding and everything. It's a pretty amazing structure, amazing engineers.
What's the elevation of that area where the project is?
Boy, you'd think of all the maps I made, I would have looked at that. We're in at like 6,200 feet.
Okay. And that part that's been straightened, historically I guess, what was that done with machines or?
A lot of physical hand labor and probably some small machinery. I think it was done late 1800s, early 1900s. And you see that all over northern New Mexico. Basically, any place you see agriculture,
Where was the old town? Was it a little bit north?
Right, it's kind of more in the center of that floodplain, would you say?
You think?
And in the map, there was just north and west of the project area it was gray in your color. It was kind of a circular area. Is that private land?
Yeah, that's private land inside the refuge. It's called Orphan Hill. There's a private landowner who's been very cooperative with the refuge, and there's a potential that he may sell that to the Fish and Wildlife Service at some point.
So the volunteers come and they pull weeds, and then other people, staff, do the planting?
We would have volunteers do it all.
Yeah.
Staff couldn't do it, and part of the intention of this program is to have volunteers involved in the seed harvesting, weed pulling, herbarium, all of that.
And how long is your vision of what working in that area?
I would say this site would be indefinite. We might look at over time whether the priority shifts a little bit to another place, but I think there's enough to keep us busy for a while in that area.
Do you think the funding will continue, or is 2 years going to be?
I think this program could continue without much in the way of external funding. I think we're using this now to build initial capacity, and we don't really, we're not using to pay volunteers. We'll have all the equipment. The supplies are relatively inexpensive. I think next year we could probably do this without without external funding. Our Friends group could probably raise any money for like lunches for volunteers. So basically gloves and paper bags are the main thing. Consumable things are all we need now. We have the hand tools and stuff like that.
Yes. Were there any specific species of animals that were targeted when it was designated as a wildlife refuge?
The intent, it was migratory waterfowl, and because there's a kind of a wetland habitat along the river, that was the Fish and Wildlife Service primary wildlife interest in that. And of course, once they bring it in as a refuge, though, they become interested in everything there. There's some interest in trying to get the pronghorn back in there. They're all around there, but they can't go through the fence. So there's a huge opportunity for new fencing, things like that to encourage other wildlife species. There's a lot of more public interest in raptors. Of course, there's some falcon, things like that. But the waterfowl is their main interest, particularly migratory. And that ties in with the mission of the Las Vegas and Maxwell Refuge.
This property was historically agricultural and ranching. Are there acequias throughout the property?
So there's a ditch that was not an acequia. It was a single owner ditch, and they still have, and that ditch is still used to water the hayfield, and there's a water right, and some water rights came with the transfer. But whatever acequias were there from before were long abandoned by the time we even came into the Taos.
Was the Wind River Ranch all 4,500 acres?
Actually, it was put together before from several pieces of property. Let's see, go back. So it was conceptually, could have been, actually, I think at one point, it included land across the road as well, but that was sold off. And then there's a little part right in here that the Taos sold at a good rate to their foreman who retired. And his intention is to somehow get that back to the Fish and Wildlife Service when they don't want to be out there. And then these properties could eventually transfer in.
Is there any way to gain, besides volunteering to pull weeds, is there any way to gain access to it if you wanted to photograph or?
Yes, first of all, during kind of the warm season, which started last month through probably October, there'll be monthly hikes out there, and so we need to get you on our mailing list for those. The second Saturday of every month, there's about a 2-mile, relatively easy hike to a scenic overlook that kind of takes you to a view kind of similar to that. In fact, that was taken from a place on that hike.
When you're there, then you can pull weeds.
Exactly. And you can get permits for different activities to go out and do photography, art. There's still some negotiation going on that, and it comes down in a lot of ways just to limited staff resource, even to process paperwork. But we're trying to encourage them to since it's a closed refuge, but they want public support for this, you need to give some public access in return. So there could be opportunities for nature photography that fits within the Fish and Wildlife Service 6 primary missions for refuges. All right, well, thank you very much.